Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to A Date with Darkness podcast. I'm super excited to be chatting with you guys, and I want to if you're new here, I want to welcome the folks that are, if you're new here, welcome. Come on in, sit down, pull up a chair, and let's get right into it. If you are a longtime listener and supporter of the show, welcome back. And thank you so much for your support. And if you like what you hear, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and, comment if you're watching on YouTube, or if you follow on our social media platform. I'm super excited to chat with you guys. And today's podcast has been one that's been in the making. And I had talked with you guys about doing this before, back when I did the episode on the crying narcissist and how that shows up. Or how they show up in relationships. And there was a big demand to talk about pathology in sex when it comes to narcissist, or narcissistic pathology when it comes to sex. And so I definitely want to dive right into that today, and just some of the things that I pulled from, my experience as a therapist, my personal experience, and also especially with working with folks that are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. I draw a lot of experience from that because I think it adds to it, and it definitely paints a picture of how narcissism pathology shows up in narcissism, and it's always a much more extreme version. But nevertheless, as you guys may or may not know, I think I've shared this with you before, and I know I've talked about my experience in corrections before, but I worked for a long time with people that, I worked with victims of domestic violence for a long time. And then I also worked in the correctional system and probation and pretrial. I worked a lot with sex offenders, people who were child sex offenders, rapists, and had committed a number of crimes, violent crimes against persons, murders and things like that. And so when I'm when I'm talking to you about the pathology that I'm drawing from sex, a lot of that comes from my work with the sex offender population, as well as, people who had problems with, authority, or just with sex in general, including sex addiction here. And then also too, I work with folks that do have narcissistic personality disorder in my private practice. And a lot of the work that we do on narcissistic personality disorder in my private practice is on impulse control. It is on managing sexual behaviors. It is on managing how they show up in interpersonal relationships, all of which adds to what I'm going to talk about here today. Of course, I've got my handy dandy notebook with a whole lot of things that I've written down on it that's going to help to guide me. So let's just get right into it. The first thing that I want to mention is I was listening on TikTok the other day, and a gentleman said something that made me think about my experience in corrections. And what he was saying was that if a man is staring at you for a long time without breaking eye contact, then most likely he's thinking about sexually assaulting you. And I want to preface again the disclaimer about being triggered and listener discretion, but I want to say that is something that I found to be very true, especially when I worked in corrections, is that men who would whenever you're working with an offender of any kind, the first thing they try to do is they try to gain the upper hand or power in a relationship. And especially when you're dealing with, when I've dealt with men who were sexual predators, and part of that is by seeing how much inappropriate things that they could get away with. And one of them is inappropriate staring, when it's sexually menacing and inappropriate staring. And this came up quite a bit during my time, and it was something that I would have to give a disciplinary action towards an inmate for, because they know that it's something that they're not supposed to be doing. However, they want to try to gain power, and so part of their attempts to gain power is to intimidate whoever they're in the room with. And women experience this a lot more than men. And I've worked in male facilities. I've also worked with women, but I experienced this more in male facilities with the staring component, and staring in a sexually inappropriate way, and sort of kind of glaring and not breaking eye contact. And that would be something that I would have to reprimand someone for doing, and which would lead to a disciplinary action and all those kinds of things. So be mindful of people who are staring at you in a way and where they're just sort of glaring at you, and it is very inappropriate. They may be looking you up and down, but typically a violent person will not break eye contact, and they will do it in a way that's very menacing, and very scary and very intimidating. And that is very real. So I wanted to bring that up as number one. With narcissists in general, there has not been a narcissist that I haven't worked with that hasn't been sexually fluid. And what I mean by that is there are narcissists, especially when I've worked with men, and that's where the bulk of my experiences come with, but I have worked a lot with women, also female narcissists. But sexuality is very fluid. And the reason why this comes up as problematic or predatory is because a lot of times when their sexuality is fluid, their sexual partners or the person that they're married to or in a long-term relationship with doesn't know that. They haven't been forthcoming in talking about that. They may engage in relationships, same-sex relationships, outside of their primary relationship that they're supposed to be involved in, or engage in other sexual behavior outside of their primary partner. And a lot of times it is very risky sex. And what I mean when I say risky, I mean that, when working with men, they don't use condoms. They may be, fixated on meeting up with people daily or regularly to have sex and not be worried about what the consequences are. So they may contract an STD. They may have a child outside of wedlock, other things like that, all because they weren't worried about the consequences, and they were being very reckless with their body, and they're in turn being very reckless with your body. And so, and I'm sure, I've had doctors on the show before, medical doctors, that talk about sexual health. And I think it's so important to talk about sexual health, and especially when it comes to a woman's sexual health, if you're involved in a heteronormative relationships. In the gynecology world, or obstetrics and gynecology world, women, in talking with gynecologists and things like that, and just kind of looking at research from the past, women are likely to contract STDs from a partner that they've been with and that they think that they're monogamous with long term. Much more likely to contract an STD from a partner that they thought that they were in a monogamous relationship with, versus whenever they may go out and be, they may engage in much more free-spirited sexual encounters. So if you're kind of, if you're kind of having these encounters and you're just kind of engaging, the research is showing that you're much more likely to contract an STD from a partner that you've been in a long-term relationship with, or that you felt like you were in a long-term monogamous relationship with. And you're much more likely to go along and feel like things are fine because you're in a relationship with a monogamous partner. You want to trust and believe that the partner you're with is monogamous and wouldn't betray you in such a way, and not only not betray you, but also violate your body in such a way to bring things back home. That is something that comes up in terms of predatory sexual behavior, in terms of the impulsivity and not being honest and forthcoming about who you're engaging in sex with. And those things are very important to know. I know there's a lot of people that say, oh, well, you shouldn't ask about, prior sexual relationships and blah, blah, blah. Not true. I'm not an advocate of that. I'm an advocate of being forthcoming, because if you're sharing your body, your time, and your energy with someone, you have every right to know. And along the lines of sexual fluidity, in my time in corrections, specifically in California corrections, we recognize and treat transgender inmates. And what I noticed, what tends to happen, or what was happening when I worked in corrections years ago, was that you would have men that would come in and then they would want to transition into females. There are some things that I noticed about the population of folks that I worked with. The ones that you typically wanted to transition from male to female. And I'm not saying this is the case across the board. I'm just saying that this is what I've noticed in ones that I've worked with. In men who had committed especially heinous crimes against women. They were especially violent, and maybe even had gone to extremes, like where a woman was within inches of her life or dismembered in certain ways, certain things like that. Those were ones that were more likely to want to transition to female gender. And again, I'm not saying that's always the case, but just in my time in working in corrections, a lot of the people that I saw, again, were the ones that were extremely violent towards women that wanted to then become a woman. And then also, there was also a high incident of sex offenders as well, too, that also wanted to transition over to being a woman. And so those were certain things that I noticed. And, in the gender fluidity and in corrections, when if you're in a male prison, if you're able to become a woman, you become a hot commodity sexually. So your value and your status becomes much more higher, because sex sells, right? And if you're a woman, you're a woman in a male prison, then you become such a hot commodity in prison. And it's like, you have inmates that are fighting over, transgender women. They want to room, and, it just becomes this hot commodity. So there is, again, the overarching theme, there is, again, wanting that attention, that sexual attention, and, having people just sort of fawning over you. And that, it was always interesting to watch when summertime or springtime came around, and then they would sort of, transgender inmates would come out, and then they're kind of like provocative, right? And then they, because it's like a season, it's like a seasonal change. It's like, oh wow, it's summertime now, and I want to see May the Best Man win, but I want all this male attention, and wearing as little clothes as possible and trying to, basically increase their value, but also being very sexually active. And I want to preface this by saying that I don't have anything against transgender. I'm speaking about what my experience is, in working in corrections there. So again, with the sexual preoccupation there. Thirdly, how narcissism, predatory narcissistic behavior shows up, is when you have older people that are lusting after younger people, whether you're lusting after, so for example, like there's no reason that, a 38-year-old man should want to date an 18-year-old woman. And I'm not saying that there's not some exceptions, but what I am saying is usually when I see a huge age gap in relationships, and of course there are some exceptions, but when you see a huge age gap and someone is extremely young and very impressionable, hasn't lived their life, again, it's for, purposes of having a hot young commodity, and also with a person who the older person typically desires to have the upper hand and control in the relationship. Again, those are general trends, and that's not always the case. But again, a younger person is much more impressionable. They don't have as much worldly experience in most cases, and so they're viewed as being easily manipulated by predators, okay? And the other thing is, with a younger person that's easily manipulated by a predator, it's not uncommon for a predator to want to sabotage a younger person's life by having them have children early, or do something where they're tied down very quickly and for a long time, and they feel like they're doing something to that younger person that would make them much less desirable to the general dating pool, so that if anything ever happens in their relationship, like they can't really go out and get someone else as easily. This is the thinking of a predator, right? Or a person that is intentionally trying to sabotage you sexually. So reproductive control is a very real issue that comes up in predatory narcissistic behavior. Another predatory sexual behavior is where narcissists get jobs where they have access to younger and vulnerable people. So for example, one element where this comes up is teachers. You might have some older teachers, and I remember very clearly when I was in high school, especially with phys ed teachers or coaches and things like that. Teachers have access to these young people, right? And then if you're in a gym outfit and things like that. And I remember when I was in high school, there were teachers that were very sexually inappropriate. And you see, and even in corrections, I remember very clearly teachers in the educational prison system were always getting in trouble. It seemed like a teacher was getting fired every week. And when you work with inmates, they're considered to be a vulnerable population, right, and property of the state. So there's no reason. Everyone knows that you're not supposed to be engaging with a potentially vulnerable population, but I remember that very clearly in high school and in corrections, where people were just they would lose their job, or they would kind of get caught in these situations where they are exploiting or having sex with an inmate, and which is a very serious issue. At least in California, you're supposed to, if that ever happens, if you ever get caught, if you work in the prison system or the correctional system and you get caught engaging in a sexual relationship with an inmate, you are supposed to be charged as a sex offender after that. So that's a very serious issue. But I just remember, like, where people have access to young and vulnerable people. And there's a famous case that, was a Lifetime movie, Mary Kate Letourneau. She was a teacher, and she fell in love, I believe, with her student who was in the 6th grade, if I'm not mistaken. So she was a grown woman, was already married. And I think, if my memory serves me correctly, he was 12 years old. And this isn't to bash teachers by any stretch of the means, but anytime you have people that are in jobs, certain people seek out certain jobs so that they can have access to vulnerable people. Another place which is where I've worked would be a rehabilitation or skilled nursing facility. A lot of times you have people that are comatose or just in a bad way, where they may be severely impaired in some way. In fact, there was a case, I believe it was maybe like a couple of years ago during COVID, I believe it was out of Arizona, where a woman who was in a coma and had been in a coma for some years turned up pregnant. And it turned out that, again, one of the staff people that was working with her were, sexually assaulting her. And so that's an example that demonstrates how vulnerable people can be taken advantage of and mistreated and abused. And she couldn't speak up for herself and advocate for herself, but people, it was like a big investigation to determine, like, how did this woman come up pregnant if she's been in a coma for a number of years? Another predatory narcissistic behavior is where narcissists will seek out partners who have children, specifically for the reason of having access to their children, access to prey sexually on their children. And so that is also something that happens. Here's another sidebar to that, or maybe the flip side of that, which I think is very much predatory. And I think this person is actually more responsible than the narcissist violating your children, is that the parent of the children. So, for example, if you feel, I'm going to clear this up. If your children ever express to you that they don't feel safe around your partner, or they don't want to be alone or in the presence of your partner because they're afraid, or they don't like the way your partner treats them, you are responsible for your child's welfare. And if you dismiss your child, or you're not paying attention to what their concerns are, you are more responsible than the predator in that situation. And I can't stress that enough. And I draw a very hard line, and I've made, over the years, because I'm a mandated reporter through the state of California. What that means is, if a child is being abused, by law, I am supposed to make a report. And I can't tell you how many reports that I've made of people that just were willing to look the other way, even with older siblings and things like that, that would just, I don't want to make this report, and I don't want to say anything about it. And I just want my child to kind of go along to get along, and really dismissing their child. And I draw a very hard line with that. And I'll tell you something else. I was watching this show, and I don't watch TV very often, but I was watching this show. I think it's on, I don't even know what channel it comes on. I think I watch it on Amazon, but it's called Evil Lives Here. And it's the latest season. And there was a woman who, she had this man that she was seeing, and he wasn't about much. And then, she allowed him to move into her home with she and her children. And her children had expressed repeatedly to her that, they didn't feel safe, that this man they didn't like him. And, on the show, on the episode, she talked about how her daughter, they read her daughter's diary aloud on the episode, and the daughter was talking about how she felt like she couldn't talk to her mother because her mother was so obsessed with this man that she just wasn't hearing what her concerns were. And I won't tell you everything that happened in that episode, but I think that gives you, the daughter did experience a significant amount of harm. And they were talking about this after the fact, and she was just so like befuddled that she didn't know, and that she, but she was just so obsessed with having this male counterpart in her life that she was just willing to overlook everything, and she put her children in direct harm's way just for the sake of having a partner. And so that happens quite a bit. But if you are one of those people that are so male-centered or female-centered that you neglect hearing what your children's needs are, you're willing to overlook the safety and well-being of your children just so that you can have a partner, you are much more responsible for what happens, and should be liable for what happens more so than the predator, because your job is to protect the safety and well-being of your children. If you knowingly bring your children around, this is also another nuance. Again, working with sex offenders, and sex offenders aren't supposed to be around small children, but you would be surprised at how many people go against that, knowing that the person that they're with is convicted of a sex offense, and they bring their small children or their children of any age around that sex offender and leave them unattended and so on and so forth. But again, just sort of that male or female centered scope of thinking, like, I'd rather have my partner, I don't care, or he or she's given me some excuse that it wasn't really a sex offense, and I may have been warned by the probation officer, but to hell with that. I'm gonna do what I want to do for the sake of having a partner. But again, this is where I think the predatory behavior is actually on the parent, right? And again, that trait, right? It's not necessarily a full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, but it certainly is a trait where you're willing to overlook exploitation or manipulation or endangerment of someone else just because you want to be selfish for your own needs. Here's one that I think also falls in the trait category of predatory behavior, or at least intergenerational behavior that has some detrimental consequences to children. And I put this in this episode because I think this gets dismissed or overlooked a lot. But when you pressure your child not to have autonomy over their bodies, or you cause your child to feel ashamed of how your body is developing and feelings. So what I mean by that is you have parents who pressure their children to hug or kiss or be close to a relative or a friend, even though that child has expressed that I don't like touching that person, or I don't like this person touching me. So when you tell your child, you kind of force your child to do it anyway, even though that you don't want to, that causes a child to feel like they don't have any boundaries over their own body, meaning they can't tell people, even if something doesn't feel comfortable, like some form of touch, if some form of touch doesn't feel comfortable to them, then they don't have the power. The power is taken away from them to say, no, I don't like that, or no, that doesn't feel good to me, or no, I don't want that, right? And you should be able to have the autonomy over your body to say, I don't want you in my space, or that makes me feel uncomfortable, or no, I don't want to feel you're in my space and I don't feel comfortable with what you're doing, or I don't want to engage with you in that way. Like, a child or anyone should be able to say that. But when you take that power away, and also when adolescents have sexual feelings and desires or things like that, when they are shamed about, having desires, having feelings, as opposed to talking about that and having some education and things around that. There's oftentimes you're shamed, or you're, especially with young girls, girls may be shamed and told that they are, categorized in terms of being loose, and that they shouldn't do that, or, that means that they're whores or things like that, just sort of these inappropriate inappropriate things, where they're basically shamed for having feelings, as opposed to, encouraged to talk about them and exploring them and getting curious about them. And I think this might have been 4 years ago. I had a podcast with Janae, who talked about this, and talked about how Black girls especially are called fast and grown, and they're sort of given these negative derogatory labels for their body, for their feelings about sex and things like that, or having just desires even in adolescence. If a child is shamed for their bodies, so there are people that may develop early, right? And if a child is shamed for, developing early, like, oh, your boobs are too big, your butt is too big, or your body is constantly critiqued, like you have, if you're a young girl, you have male uncles and things like that are constantly critiquing and looking at you like in that way. Oh, you're developing. Oh, you're gonna, and just sort of making these comments about your body, or if your child is told to, you need to cover up because so and so is coming over, such and such family members coming over, and I don't want them looking at you like that. And so the child is taught very early on that, they would be responsible if something happens, right? And they want to prevent anything from happening. And the way that you can prevent yourself from being victimized is by covering yourselves up, or you're taught to be ashamed of how your body looks, right? Because your body is sexually provocative. And, there's, especially with young girls, again, you have these older men that are sort of ogling at them and making comment. And instead of their behavior being corrected, or them being asked to leave the home, that's sort of encouraged, and the child is sort of, again, told that they need to cover up, and, that they're not going to be protected, but, you need to do this, and that you're the problem, so to speak. So that, again, does a number on a person's psyche, right? And again, that behavior is encouraged, where it's like, oh, men may be men, or people will be people, but the onus is on you to not be victimized, right? If a child has a sexual experience and they're humiliated, that falls under that parenting behavior there. So if you have an experience where maybe, again, in adolescence, you get caught and your parent wants to humiliate you in front of everyone, or even, another adult may want to humiliate you, that falls in sort of that dysfunctional parenting behavior, which is a total sidebar, but I'm going to put that in there. So going back to pathological narcissistic behavior with sex, pornography is a big one. And I can't express this enough. Pornography is fantasy-based sex, but just about every narcissist that I have worked with has been addicted to pornography. And pornography is a form of escapism and avoidance, but it's also fantasy based. It's something where the narcissist feels like they can control it. It's also a lot of it, which can be consumed, can be humiliating and devalue the other person. Not all of it, of course, but with the ones that I've worked with, again, a lot of it is humiliating and devaluing the other person. This is also maybe where some of the sexual fluidity may manifest, right? If they're sort of engaging and watching in, maybe gay porn or pornographic material of someone that they say that they're of particular folks that they say that they aren't attracted to, or they've never openly expressed that they're attracted to. Pornography is a huge one, and pornography is something that they can be addicted to, they can get in trouble for. So, I've even recalled situations where, at where I've worked at specific places, and maybe the person who does IT work has gotten in trouble for consuming pornography at work, and gotten in trouble for things like that. So again, where it starts to impede your social and your occupational functioning, and it becomes like an obsession, something that you have to do daily to relieve anxiety, or you're just sort of you find it much more easy to watch pornography than you do to engage in a relationship with a real person, or a sexual experience with a real person, or even a sexual experience with a real person. You want it to be an exact replica of the pornographic material that you're watching. And this is especially true, when you have people that watch child pornography and things like that. And then, with the folks that I worked with that were child sex offenders, anytime they saw a child, it instantly became pornographic. This is one of the reasons why I don't agree with people who put their children on social media, children and pets, actually, because it's not just child pornography, but also bestiality and things like that we see in these pathological, narcissistic, predatory behaviors. Is that they become an opportunist when it comes to sex, right? And so sidebar, I don't have a right to tell people what to do, but I just know that when you put your children on social media, or any sort of public platform, there's a good chance they're going to be sexualized. And that was one of the big things that I worked with when I worked with folks. I worked with them in terms of sexualizing children in any capacity, right? Because then it becomes just opportunistic at some point, and people can fall so deep into that addiction, and pornography too, right? And then pornography can also lead into risky sexual behavior. So engaging in sex with prostitutes or things like that. Random sex without protection and things like that, just frequent, risky sexual encounters, right? So that opens up that gateway there. So next, I want to move on to another big one that I get, and I'm going to do a separate episode on this one altogether, is when you take provocative pictures of your partner without consent. So it's not uncommon for a narcissist to take pictures of their partner while their partner is sleeping, so unconscious. So they may take nude photos, or take your photos of you nude or in a compromising position while you're unconscious and you can't give consent. Or maybe you send risky photos as part of your romance. They will hold that against you. So again, the whole taking your photos without consent, or doing something with your photos without consent, or using that in a way to keep you emotionally and relationally hostage. So they want to keep you hostage in the relationship with these photos, but also they have some sort of power over you. And this has come into play with a lot of folks that I've worked with, especially when they're ready to leave that relationship and they don't want anything to do with that partner anymore. First thing that partner will do in their fit of rage will go and grab their photos and threaten to leak photos of them everywhere and put them on every website, and really harass them and coerce them into staying in a relationship in that way. But also, by them having pictures, it's almost like a memento that they hold on to. It's like a plaque, if you will, of like, this is a prize. This is something that I sort of keep, as part of my sex addiction. I hold on to these things here, and it makes me feel powerful. It's a conquest. It is a thing that I could sort of, a photo or something, again, that you can control, you can manipulate in your mind, and you can go back to it over and over again. You may even have narcissistic partners that hold on to pictures from partners from years ago. So they're like trophies and things like that, relationships that have been over or allegedly over for years, and they'll hold on to those photos. Sex without disclosing an STD, an active STD, or a permanent STD. So again, just to give an example here, and I've worked with this quite a bit, in terms of people who actively may have something like HIV and they don't disclose, they don't use protection, and they may not take medication, right? And they can be very reckless. In fact, there and again, I was watching, I think again, that same show, Evil Lives Here, where a woman was talking about being with a partner who watched her get sick while he knowingly infected her with HIV. And that is also something that is common, where a person is not concerned about your welfare or your well-being and will, not disclose, but also so you don't have the opportunity to say yes or no, you don't protect yourself, or they may even go as far as to lie, produce, false negative test results, which again, was part of that episode that I was looking at, where a person will go to the extreme and say, oh, I got tested and was cleared and blah, 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 and I don't have anything and I'm clean. So always make sure that, whenever you're talking to your partner about sex and sexual history, you either go with them to the doctor's office or you see a hard copy of test results, right? So don't just, have an open discussion, but you guys can go together, or you're having a discussion about it while you see the actual results from LabCorp, Quest Diagnostics, wherever the case may be, but make sure you're looking at some legitimate results. And I talked again about risky sex. But, risky sex can be, having, extra affairs at work. This comes up a lot in working in the industry that I've worked in for a long time. And that, it's kind of like when you get to work, it's understood that you're no longer married or in a relationship. Everybody's single. And so it just became this pool of like, oh, I'm going to sleep with this person, this person, this person, this person. Risky sex again with prostitutes, with same sex or opposite sex, and not disclosing that you're engaging in sex with that, and particularly if you're a male and you are living a heterosexual life, and you are engaging in homosexual activity, there is a much greater risk if you are a man engaging in homosexual behavior. Statistically, so for example, statistically speaking, it's much harder for a woman to pass HIV to a man just through sexual contact. It's much easier for a man to pass or infect a woman with HIV virus sexually than it is for a woman to infect a man. And statistically, that's just the way it goes. So statistically speaking, women are much more at risk if a man were to engage in that type of behavior. So that certainly ups the ante, and it's very serious. Not to say that it wouldn't be anyway, but again, statistically speaking, you have people that are at a much higher risk, and it's just reckless behavior anyway. Here's another one that's very predatory: is having sex with your partner while your partner is unconscious. So if your partner is sleeping, if they're passed out drunk, or they're passed out from some sort of medication or something like that, and your partner is having sex with you, technically they are committing a sex crime, and it is illegal, right? And that is considered to be sexual assault. If a person is having sex with you while sleeping. And of course, of several major cases and where this was widely publicized. So Bill Cosby, allegedly was one of those, right? Was convicted. And then another one that comes to mind, which they made a movie about, was Andrew Luster. He was the Max Factor heir. That's the big makeup industry. He was the heir to that, where he allegedly sexually assaulted a bunch of women and recorded that while they were unconscious, had given them roofies, date rape drugs and all kinds of stuff, allegedly. And you could watch that. There's a movie about that where you could see that. But that gives you an idea. Sex while unconscious. Stealthing is another form of coercive control, reproductive coercive control, and also predatory narcissistic behavior, and also a person can be held liable for that. But stealthing is the act of when you are having sex with a partner, with a man, and that man takes off a condom without your consent, and they do it without you even knowing that you're doing it, and so they're having unprotected sex with you. That is extremely predatory, and the idea behind this, as well as having sex with someone while they're unconscious, is a person is unable to consent. And that's why it's considered a sexual assault, is because a person's not giving you consent to have sex with them or sexual intercourse with them or have unprotected sex with them. And so again, that they're taking control of the situation and wanting to take control over you by taking away your power. And that's very concerning when you're in a relationship with someone, or you're engaged in someone in that way, and that they don't care about what your needs are. They don't care about your safety and your well-being. They're being very inappropriate, to say the least. And they are assaulting you if they're engaging in this. And this is predatory behavior. There's no two bones about it. That is very predatory. And a person who does these things feels like they're going to do what they want to do, and they don't care how you feel about it, essentially. Another thing that may fall into that category, another thing that may be considered behavior that's inappropriate in having sex with a person, and he's a person that's not concerned about your welfare in the bedroom, and so they're not concerned about how you feel, whether or not anything is pleasurable, if it's okay. They're not concerned about you at all. They're just there having their fun, and then they're kind of walking away from the situation. And so while it may be consensual, the person is not emotionally engaged or attuned to what the other person is feeling or experiencing, and they don't care. They don't care to do that. And it's not a discussion that they ever want to engage in or bring up, right? That person is most likely a predator, because when you have someone that is almost like, you're a piece of meat, I'm going to do with you what I will, and I don't care how you feel about it. That person does have some pathology around sexual behavior, and especially if they sort of, if they use a method of avoidance, or they sort of weaponize incompetence, but they're not interested in hearing about things. They're not interested in problem solving. They're not interested in changing things up, and they just kind of get up and skedaddle right on out of there. You're looking at behavior that is predatory. It's very manipulative. And it's not predatory in the same way in some of the other stuff that I've mentioned, but nonetheless, it is something that is designed to be manipulative. I'm going to take advantage of a situation because I know that this person may feel powerless, or they may feel like they don't want to speak up and hurt my feelings, or I'm just very selfish and self-centered, and I'm going to do what I want to do and move on. Yeah. Most likely you are dealing with a narcissist when you are dealing with people that do not care, or they're not invested in your well-being when it comes to sex, period. Point blank. And even if that person seems to be nice and have a kind mannerism, if they're not in tune with you, and there's no desire for you to be pleasured, there's no desire to seek any feedback from you, that's a person that's showing that they're very self-centered and egotistical. And then if you were to bring something up, and their ego is, they're just kind of nonchalant, That's, again, just be mindful of that, because again, this person is likely to engage in some other things. Not always, but more than likely. A person that disguises their true intentions in a relationship just to hook up with you sexually, that is that is a very characteristic narcissistic trait. And what I mean by that, you see that a lot now in the new realm of dating, especially in the online dating world, is a person may enter into dating you under the false pretense that they want to date and they want to possibly pursue a relationship, when really all they want to do is hook up with you. And so they'll create a false persona. They'll create this fake agenda. They'll fake being interested with you, engaging in conversation with you, until they get what they want. And until they get what they want, they're out the door. They may ghost you. They're going to leave you high and dry. They're going to block you. They don't have any interest in talking to you anymore. This is, again, that falls in line with that predatory behavior, because do you know how much energy it takes to you're basically changing your identity, and you're basically being manipulative from the start in order to have another sexual conquest. It's interesting the extent to which someone will go to lie, just to have that. So, that's also predatory, right? Because this person is gaslighting you. They are deluding you into thinking that they want something more, and they are really acting in order to get what they want. And that is very, very predatory. And unfortunately, I've been seeing this a lot more and more, especially with online dating, when you have people that they sleuth, they have these different identities, they may have these different names, they may be married, right, and not engaging in, or not being forthcoming about telling folks that they have this different life or that they're this different person. But what they'll do is they'll pretend, and they can pretend for a month, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months to be a totally different individual. And they'll keep up the lie going until they get what they want, and then they're out of there. And it's all to feed, to get sex. And it's actually quite scary when you think about it, how far someone will go to in order to have a sexual conquest, that they're willing to lie and manipulate another individual. But it does happen. Okay, so I know that there's a ton more, but for the interest in time in this podcast, I'm going to leave it there. Definitely drop that down in the comments below. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Of course, I can sort of go on and on and on, but I'd love to know what your thoughts are. If there were some things that I didn't mention in this podcast because of the interest in time, and because I feel like my voice is getting a little scratchy, probably just from the fact that I'm getting back into the swing of doing podcasting, right? So my voice is getting used to that. But let me know what your thoughts are, if you found this helpful, and if there's anything else you want to throw out there that you've seen also. And you guys, be sure to support your small podcast and show some love by liking, sharing, and subscribing, and leaving a comment if you're watching on YouTube. And until next time, you guys take care of yourselves. Thanks for watching. Be well.